Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. My name is Leah Hines. I'm the Executive Director of the Charleston Library Conference, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Organizing for OA, New Business Models for Collective Action. Today's session is being recorded, and a link to the video will be sent to everyone who's registered for the session, and it'll also be made openly available on the Charleston Conference website. We'll be saving all questions for our panelists until the end. I'll go through instructions in just a minute for how to do the Q&A button and how to submit those questions. The presenters are going to try to keep their presentations to around 7 to 10 minutes or so each, so that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So be sure to send your questions. And we would ask that you please complete a very short attendee evaluation. When the session is over, you'll be automatically redirected to that. Today's session is being held using the Zoom platform, which I'm sure we're all familiar with at this point. But just a few brief housekeeping notes about Zoom. When you connect, it asks you to set up your audio through the computer speakers. If you're having problems with hearing for any reason, you can also use the telephone to connect, or you can send me a note by the chat and I'll try to help sort out any problems that I can. At the bottom, you can see there's 3 icons: chat, raise hand, Q&A. We're not going to be using that raise and lower hand function today, but the one I want you to pay attention to is right next to it, that Q&A button. Pop-up window will come up and you can put your question in at any time. So during any of the presentations, if something comes to mind that you're wondering about, you have a question or a comment, please go ahead and drop that in and we'll save those until the end. And then moving on from there, I'm going to introduce, we have 4 wonderful presenters today. I'd like to thank each of them for participating and give just a quick introduction, just name and affiliation, and then turn things over for the presenters. We're joined by Emily Farrell, who is Library Partnerships and Sales Lead at the MIT Press. Alison Bradley, Director of Strategic Initiatives at PALCI. Raym Crow, owner of Chainbridge Group. And Peter Potter, Publishing Director, University Libraries at Virginia Tech. So thanks to all 4 of you, and I believe Raym is going to be our first presenter for the day, so I will turn things over to him at this point. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. What I'd like to do is, as context for the discussions of specific collection support models, I'd like to sketch out some of the issues that affect the design of such models more generally. Next slide, please. We'll start by quickly reviewing the collective action problem in providing open resources. Then we'll describe the principal issues that need to be addressed in designing a collective offer. We'll also describe how various characteristics of an open resource affect the design of the model to support it. And finally, we'll provide a very high-level overview of common approaches to sustaining open resources. Given the time constraint, we'll have to keep all of this at a general level, but we can go into more detail if there are any more questions. Next slide, please.
1 second, it seems we may have a problem with the presentation view. Leah, would you mind double checking that you're sharing, that it's that?
I'm seeing your screen. I see it's just not in presentation mode. It's presenter mode.
I see, 1 second. It's showing the notes.
Right.
Okay. Nope. Sorry about that. Got it. Is that working?
Not yet. I believe you may have to. Oh.
Okay, let me try that again. Sorry.
There you go.
Got it. All right, good. Sorry, Raym, let's try that again.
Okay. So if we can go to the collective action problem slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So open resources, whether we're talking about content like monographs or open infrastructure, have the characteristics of public goods. That is, access to the resource can't be limited, either practically or as a matter of mission. It also means that the resource isn't consumed by use, regardless of how many users or how much use it receives. What this means in practice is that when a resource is openly available, it's in the narrow self-interest of an individual institution not to contribute to its provision, but to leave it to others to pay. And this can lead to a resource not being provided, even though each institution individually would be better off if it were. At the same time, the collective action problem isn't absolute. Some institutions may contribute to many open resources, while some may never contribute, and others may contribute occasionally under specific conditions. And all of this can lead to a resource being underprovided relative to what the demand for the resource would otherwise be. And this is a common issue for open resources and can result in them being undercapitalized and operating suboptimally. Next slide, please. So to be successful, an open model needs to mitigate, if not completely overcome, the collective action problem. In practical terms, this means that the funding offer for an open resource needs to address several specific issues. First, it's necessary to define the target group for the offer. Sizing the target group has practical implications because it can be expensive to organize collective activity, and it's typically easier to coordinate smaller groups. Also, defining the group of institutions that are expected to benefit most directly from a resource is necessary for setting participation thresholds. This is an interesting topic in its own right, but it's really, we don't have enough time to explore it today. It's also critically important that an offer has some way to motivate a sufficient number of institutions to contribute. So like a regular business model, a collective support model needs a compelling value proposition. And as we'll discuss, it will typically require motivation beyond mission-driven altruism. The model also needs to be constructed to maintain adequate support over time. When only a small number of institutions using a resource are contributing to its support, over time, this perceived inequity of some institutions contributing while others don't will erode participation, making the funding unstable. And finally, the offer needs to be structured and presented to maximize and accelerate participation. This often takes the form of a time-boxed assurance contract where an institution's support commitment is explicitly contingent on sufficient participation by other institutions. Next slide. Of course, the specific characteristics of the open resource also affects the model's design. For example, the offer for a new resource or for an existing resource that's currently closed can be constructed to make openness contingent on sufficient funding being committed. This gives the provider some leverage to encourage support, although this leverage isn't typically sufficient motivator by itself. It's also worth noting that this provision leverage substitutes initial risk for long-term risk. That is, if you make provision of a resource contingent on its receiving adequate upfront support, and that support doesn't materialize, then the resource wouldn't be provided at all. And this could be an unattractive prospect for many resource providers, so they may sometimes try to avoid it. However, one could argue that if the community demand for a resource is inadequate, it would be preferable to know that upfront rather than to live along without adequate funding on an ongoing basis. One other advantage of existing resources is that they can typically demonstrate demand and use, making it easier to identify the target group and set participation thresholds. Looking at other relevant characteristics, a funding model's structure will depend on whether the resource has a single all or nothing provision point, or whether the amount of the resource provided depends on the amount of funding available. For example, whether more journal articles or monographs would be open if more funds are available. Although some initiatives represent one-time offers, most open resources require ongoing funding over time, which typically means some kind of recurring offer. And of course, the size and structure of the cost hurdle that needs to be cleared can affect all aspects of an offer. Next slide. So turning to the funding models themselves, there are four principal approaches to providing public goods. In the public arena, most civic public goods, national defense, for example, or police services, are funded via taxation. However, while the government could fund open science infrastructure as a matter of public policy, that approach isn't directly applicable or available to us for the types of individual open resources we're discussing here. In some cases, small groups of individuals or institutions might collaborate to provide an open resource. where the local benefit of doing so is sufficient, even if non-contributors also benefit. In our space, we often see this with open source software initiatives. In these cases, the sponsoring institutions may act out of a desire to control the direction of the design of a solution. Most collective funding offers, however, rely on some combination of altruism and private benefits. Many collective funding models, including so-called membership models, rely on altruism to motivate contributions. That is, they depend on institutions being willing to contribute because support of a resource aligns with their mission. To motivate contributions, altruism typically relies on social incentives. In effect, an institution's desire to do or to be seen to do the right thing. Such incentives tend to be most effective in small, cohesive groups, and they become less effective as the size of the target group increases. So in some cases, for example, where costs are very low, altruism may be a sufficient motivator. However, relying on altruism to sustain an expensive resource with a large global user base, especially on an ongoing basis, can be very risky. Another common approach to funding open resources is to offer some kind of exclusive benefit available only to contributors. Freemium models are one example of this, and they can work where the cost of creating the private benefit represents a joint cost of providing the open benefit. In other words, where it's feasible to offer different versions of the service. Otherwise, however, private benefits can be expensive to provide. The most prevalent type of private benefit for open sources seems to be a role in the governance of the resource. That's why many open resources are positioned as membership organizations, as this can satisfy library procurement policies that forbid donative payments. But while governance might be a compelling motivator for some resources, the value of such input will vary and may not always justify the cost of the contribution for others. Other types of private benefits, such as value-added services, are essentially market transactions. This can work as long as institutions place sufficient value on the private benefit. However, in cases where the contribution required exceeds the value of the private benefit, in effect combining private benefit and altruism as motivators, there can be tension. This is because research has shown that offering private benefits tends to crowd out altruistic behavior. So private benefits need to be presented carefully to minimize this effect. I could go on in more detail, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there. And of course, we can address any more detailed questions in the Q&A segment. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks so much, Raym. And so I'm going to take over now and talk a little bit about MIT Press and a little bit of the history of what we've done in open access, our oncoming open access books model, direct to open, talk a little about a few of the challenges ahead and some next steps. So MIT Press has been experimenting with open access and freely readable digital works for over 2 decades now. First in books and then more extensively in journals. We also have the privilege of being a press at an institution and reporting to a library that continues to push the boundaries for open access. So that includes financial investment from MIT libraries to support select books being made open access. We've also published books open access with the support of Tome, which Peter will talk about later, as well as from the Mellon Foundation's Humanities Open Book Program. All of these programs have been integral in supporting our increasing open access book content, but at the same time, support from varying foundations and funds, as well as book processing charges where authors have had access to them, hasn't been able to provide a comprehensive, equitable or sustainable long-term solution that enables our whole monographs program to be open access at publication. So in considering the ways we could do that, to make our monographs program open, the best pathway that presents itself is through a collective action effort. So last year, so in 2019, we received support from the Arcadia Fund to develop a business model that, when successful, will allow us to open our monographs program moving forward. The model that we've developed with Raym will take a collective action approach through the support of libraries worldwide. We'll be working with libraries, with consortia in particular, asking for commitments of support in 2021, so next year, with the aim to open 2022 monographs program of around 90 books and then moving forward. And so when we talk about monographs, we do mean that broadly to also include edited academic works, but not trade books. We'll offer 2 collections, and library supporters will receive an incentive. They'll have term access for a year to the corresponding back file for the collection or the collections that they support, which will remain gated. So prior years will remain gated. The model aims to recover about 55% of first copy direct costs for a target of 1.6 million. To increase the chances that the model will be funded successfully, we'll be offering these 2 collections, Art, Design and STEM, and Humanities and Social Sciences. This will allow libraries to commit to 1 collection or the complete set of books. It means it provides us with a chance of partial funding for the model and therefore lowers the threshold for success. The target will remain 1.6 million. If we reach the target for 1 collection, surplus will cascade to the other collection. And if there's an overall surplus, it will be credited to fund future years of the model. So implementing a collective action model is not a small task. Over the course of the last year, we've looked at best approaches and worked closely with Raym to refine a model to make it, as much as possible, impossible to refuse. The model's built to offer the lowest possible pricing for each institution. We're taking into account not only FTE, but also collections budgets in setting the tiers for the model. It allows smaller associate level colleges, for example, the ability to support the model at around 39 cents per book. One particularly appealing incentive is that libraries that commit their support next year will receive access to the back file regardless of whether the front list offer is actually successful. And so we have a fixed financial target with the surplus being credited for the future. There are certainly challenges ahead for implementation. It's a completely new approach for us at MIT Press and a novel approach for funding books. To be successful, we will need around 700 libraries to support this direct to open model. We'll also need libraries to go against their urge to negotiate discounting, as Raym mentioned in his presentation, and to go against treating this as a market transaction because the costs are fixed. We'll need to do this each year. But the benefit of this is that we'll be able to take input and reconsider aspects of the model as we go on year. So there is flexibility built in. So what's next? We begin next year talking to consortia, socializing this new model. We've started to have some conversations and have already received really useful feedback from libraries, and we'll continue to do that in the coming months. And when the model is successful, it'll allow us in the following years to consider whether there are ways to scale the model, to consider cooperation, how this model that we're rolling out will be beneficial for other presses potentially. I suppose the glaring question is, what will we do if we don't get the support? We're really proud of this model and of our efforts to work towards more equitable access to knowledge in making our monographs open. So if we fail this time around, we'll go back, we'll refine the model, and we'll listen to our libraries and we'll try again. So I'll now pass the presentation over to Peter.
Thanks, Emily. Yes, my name is Peter Potter. I'm a publishing director at Virginia Tech and ARL visiting program officer for Tome. And I want to talk a bit about Tome as an approach to collective action, collective institutional action. Next slide, please. So Tome is what I think distinguishes Tome in the world of monograph publishing is inside the United States, it's really the first attempt at a national level collective effort. So it brings together 3 national level organizations, the AAU, the ARL, and Association of University Presses. Next slide, please. And the idea is then with those larger national institutions providing leadership and kind of the titular heads of this initiative, we then want to bring in funding institutions. So the idea is that faculty at institutions that participate are eligible to receive grant funding to be able to publish their books as OA monographs. So in this case, we have right now we have 18 participating funding institutions. We're about ready to add the 19th, and we have a few more in the works. So we're trying to build that base. And then next slide, will show you the participating university presses, and we have 66 of those. Most are US based, but we have some in Canada and in England as well. And thus far, 21 of those presses have published or contracted for tome books. And that number may have increased since I prepared this slide a few weeks ago. Next slide, please. So to date, Tome has published, under the Tome umbrella, we have published 60 books, and you can see sort of the breakdown from 2018 when we started. This is a 5-year pilot project, so we're entering year 4. And we've been able to support the work of 76 different authors and editors. Some of the books are edited volumes, and you can see the breakdown of the rank of the professors. And then in these various fields, primarily, as you can see, it is really humanities and humanistic social sciences, but spread pretty evenly among all of those fields. So we've been very happy with the representation thus far. Next slide, please. So some of these, what our early lessons are, we now have enough of the books out of those 60 books. We've been able to look at about 25 of the first books, and we have enough of a history now to be able to look at what's happened with those books. And perhaps not surprisingly, the first lesson is that open access does expand usage, and it does so significantly with no, as of yet, discernible impact on sales. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the usage, so in those first 25 books where you can see the number of downloads, and that's chapters and full book downloads versus average print sales. The blue line there, that is what the average print sales for when a book is available as a tome book. It is available as a print book and as an OA book for free download. So the books on average are getting over 2,500 downloads, and the print sales are averaging around 400 or 445. And that bottom line is what the average comparable sales are for books that are non-OA. So there's a slight dip in the number of sales, but not significantly. Actually, I reversed that. It should be the 445 is what the average print sales would be for the typical book non-OA, and the maroon one at the bottom is what the tome books they're averaging. So the sales are down about 30 copies, but then when you compare that against the number of downloads, the usage is significantly increased. Next slide, please. And this gives you a sense of where those downloads are coming. And there's a lot of really interesting information here that we would definitely be looking into further. But you can see like JSTOR has been a significant source of the downloads. And interestingly enough, Amazon Kindle, but this surprised us that Amazon, that free Kindle, when a book is made available open access as a Kindle book, even an academic book, it does generate significant sales or significant usage, sorry. Next item or next slide. So this is just one quick example of one book that was a tome book. It's also a Luminos book through the University of California Press. And this gives you just a sense of, you can just look at the number of downloads, book downloads, chapter downloads, and then the sales, the 329 print sales at the bottom. And the amount of engagement is just over the top in terms of how much usage a book like this is getting as an OA book. Next slide, please. So the second lesson is that in addition to just usage, it also drives significant engagement. Next slide, please. So this quote here from Mike Taylor, this article that has just been published through Digital Science, this quote really sums up very well what we're seeing with Tome, which is that OA books and chapters have significantly higher use on social networks, higher coverage in mass media and blogs, and evidence of higher rates of social impact in policy documents. This chart here is from that article, and I won't go into it, but it does show that when a book is available open access, the amount of engagement in the altmetric world significantly increases. Next slide, please. And then this is just a little indicator of that same book, Revolutionary Bodies, also a Tome book, the Twitter attention and the different places where that has happened. So we're really beginning to see with these books on maybe really narrow subjects, but they get picked up in ways, in surprising ways. Next slide, please. And the third lesson that we're coming away with is that really open access is no longer new or foreign to HSS and authors and publishers. So I think one of the things if you go to the next slide, we did a author session at our Tome meeting recently, where we brought together 5 authors, not all of them Tome authors, but one of the lessons that really came out of that for me was that faculty are just, in the humanities, social sciences, they're just beginning really to understand what open access means, that STEM was way ahead of the game in terms of open access, but in the humanistic, social sciences, and humanities world, it's a newer thing. But as the faculty who are beginning to publish OA, as they do it, you can begin to see the sense of, wow, this really works. I'm getting more engagement with my readership. I'm reaching readers that I never thought I would reach before. So my sense is that as authors become more comfortable with it, and they're coming at it not just through open access books, but many of them are dealing with journals that are now going open access. So they're all getting more experience with it, and the more experience they get with it, the more comfortable they are with it. And next slide, please. And so to conclude, I would just say these are the kinds of things that I see as necessary for Tome to continue its momentum. And the first item here is that cooperation among OA book initiatives is really essential, and we do not see Tome as competing with Luminos or the Schump project at the UNC Press. These are all initiatives that we can all work together, and the more we can work together, the more collective action I think we can achieve. And we have to think about it in terms of the particular US higher ed market. We are different than Europe, and we're less top down, and there are ways to take advantage of that within the US. And we have to deal with the question of equity. As we're scaling up, we have to be clear on how we make this increasingly available to institutions, to faculty at institutions without the same wealth. But the more buy-in we have, the more ability we have with that. And a key to all of this is, from my perspective, is better metrics. The more we have metrics that show the kind of information that I was alluding to earlier, from our first 25 books, the more of a persuasive case we can make with administrators and with national level organizations that this is the way to go, and the more buy-in we will have. So thank you. Oh, and so I will turn it over now to Alison.
Great, thank you, Peter. So this is a great segue. There's a really natural role for library consortia in this conversation about collective action to support the OA monograph. That's what we exist to do. Library consortia exist for collaboration and coordination between libraries, and the relationships we build gives a strong reason to take a consortial approach in developing these new funding models. The consortial landscape is really diverse, of course, but all of us in one way or another exist to help libraries act together. My name is Alison Bradley. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at PALCI, which is a consortium of 71 academic and research libraries in Pennsylvania and the surrounding states. Next slide, please. So what does a library consortium look like? At PALCI, our original foundation was in traditional resource sharing. We're an independent nonprofit organization that is membership-based. We were founded to facilitate lending across research libraries in Pennsylvania, so literally shipping a print book from one place to another so that we could share our content that way. And our next natural steps were developing shared licensing programs for electronic resources, and today we've expanded into other types of innovation, funding, and development of open infrastructure. The library consortium landscape overall is really diverse, though. Consortia come in many different flavors. Some are consistent, like PALCI, in the type of library that they serve, and some are consistent in geography. Some of them are mandated into existence with national, state, or system level support, both financial and organizational, that give them the authority to act together towards collective goals. But others, like PALCI, are an opt-in membership organization that libraries choose to join and choose to remain a member of in order to build a new partnership that can work together. Some of us have just a handful of members, others can have thousands. The one thing that's consistent across all library consortia is that we exist because there's value to libraries in doing cooperative work. And we agree that there are reasons for us to share, whether that's our materials, our other resources, or our opportunities and our challenges. Next slide, please. So consortia are about building these connections. And obviously that comes in some level through sharing our resources so that each library can access more content than they otherwise could purchase or retain independently, whether that's through lending, collective purchasing, or retention agreements. And we can also provide efficiencies of scale, where vendors that work through a consortial relationship simplify their licensing and their invoicing across a large group. And similarly, the libraries that work through their consortia can streamline their purchasing and licensing workflows as well. And that also extends to the outreach and marketing process, where publishers or vendors can reach a larger audience than they would if their reps had to reach out to 71 separate institutions to get offers out to our entire community. But what I think is even more important in this conversation is not just building those conversations around marketing, around outreach opportunities, but also making sure that perspectives that otherwise might not make it into these discussions are heard. PALCI's membership is all academic and research libraries, but that's where the similarities end. We have ARLs, we have R1 institutions, we have state-supported schools, we have small selective liberal arts colleges, and we have specialized campuses that have all agreed to come together and try to work on shared goals. That diversity of experiences, that diversity of perspectives is really valuable in all of our collections work and in all of our other collaborative projects. And I think that that is a serious benefit in developing successful, sustainable collective funding models for open access. Absolutely key is figuring out how do you invite those smaller institutions to the table, both to give them opportunities to invest, but also opportunities to discuss where the benefits and where the challenges are for participation. Next slide, please. So last and by far the most important piece of what consortia can bring to this kind of project is trust. So we've established credibility with our members. We've done a lot of homework every time that we bring anything new, any new opportunity or project to our members to discuss. So they know that the programs that we offer and that we develop together with them are thoughtful ones and are responsive to their needs, and that we're really selective about when we ask for their time and attention. This means I've got some credit to spend. That's a way that we can help get more thoughtful attention to these opportunities from member institutions that otherwise might not have the time and the bandwidth to decide for themselves what benefits they can see and what challenges they'd need to overcome in participation. And that, again, is really the best way that we can get the most diverse group of participants at the table to build sustainable participation for these new open access monograph funding models. Next slide, please. So the next steps, what can we do together? There are some obvious, easy tasks that some of us have already started working on, right? We can help with outreach and communication in both directions, where the publishers and the vendors that are working on developing these models, we can talk with them about what we hear from our membership. We can talk with them about the ways that our members will be able to participate, and we can bring back what we hear from member discussions. We can share those perspectives in both directions and facilitate the logistics. We already have a community built around discussing opportunities and collective approaches. So bringing this question to the table is something where we can make a really easy, immediate lift. The biggest challenges that I see to initiating a consortial approach is the complexity of our environment. There are lots of overlapping agreements for consortium memberships. Even within PALCI, there are very few of our members that don't also participate actively and highly value their memberships in other groups. So, what does that landscape look like when we're trying to develop a new participatory funding model? It circles back to the point that Raym made at the very beginning, the problems with collective action. How do we develop a cross-consortial approach that avoids those challenges of exclusivity and competition when we have a really complex and diverse landscape for participation in consortial programs of any type? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our presenters. Are there any final comments before we move into the Q&A portion and the discussion with the audience? I'll take that as a no. All right, well, thank you again for those wonderful presentations. And now we will take questions from our attendees. Let's see here. This one, what kinds of memberships are available, and are the resources able to be cherry picked, or buy-in gives library member all resources? I'm thinking that may be for Alison.
Yeah, if that's kind of speaking to PALCI membership or membership broadly, I don't know if you can clarify in the Q&A window.
They could put it in the chat or submit a separate Q&A question.
Great.
While we're waiting for that, let's move on to.
Can I just say there was one question that I answered by saying that I'd answer it when, so I can address that.
Oh, I see that. Yes. A question mainly for Peter, but all thoughts welcome. In my experience, authors are often less informed about their book deals than one would like. How closely do the authors pay attention to, care about, and support the open model itself beyond the fruits it may offer them with increased engagement and other usage metrics?
Yeah, this is a great question. And one of the things that I've been looking at, I've been, on both sides of this for many years now, and on the university press side, I just see as authors become, as they see their books as open access, as they see them getting that kind of new engagement, they become themselves more involved in, they want to know, like if their book, we had one author whose book was being heavily used in East Asia. So that engagement there led her to think more seriously about how the book is translated. So they pay more attention, I think, to the terms of their agreements than maybe they did in the past, because they're seeing that the book is getting used in ways that it didn't in the past. So I've seen the sort of a positive effect on their kind of awareness.
Thank you. Any further comments on that? Okay. Here's a question from Simon. Collective action, aka crowdfunding, is going to be more successful for the first entrant than the second, third, or 100th entrant, as funds are finite. My question for Raym and Emily is, how do you get the Arcadia funding to benefit the wider UP community and not just MIT?
Part of the terms of the Arcadia agreement, and Emily can speak to this in more detail, is to design a model that's applicable to other presses as well. So it's not to say that the MIT model, every press will find equally effective, but for a number of presses, they will. And also, there's, I think, the just getting kind of normalizing these models, getting them out and getting people used to them will help additional, collective models from presses.
Yeah, so from my understanding as well, we are able to share the model itself with other university presses that have interest in working on the model, and certainly will be available to talk to other presses that are interested in trying this sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess too, the other part of the question was sort of what does this look like kind of moving forward, as if we are sort of the first one to use it, and then as the model is sort of perhaps taken up by other people, other presses, which I think is an interesting question, sort of to think about what happens when more presses are attempting to do these sorts of models. And I don't know, maybe Raym is actually a better place to answer what that looks like.
You mean what the effect is overall on the resources available, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think resources are always going to be finite, right? So the idea here is that we're trying to shift resources, make these open models so attractive that more institutions participate, which provides more social good, because now you've got open content to beyond the institutions even that supported them. So so if you can look at it one way, we're saying, okay, if you're late to the game as a university press or some publisher trying this model, you might have more trouble. The marginal participation might seem lower. At the same time, it's trying to change the whole, the way libraries behave, or not to sound patronizing about it, but how they engage with these models, and again, to encourage open models as opposed to closed models.
I just add to that too. I would say, a big part of this is I think Raym's right. Yes, we're dealing with finite resources, but we're also at this funny period where, that libraries we're still dealing with these big deals that are locking up so much of our funds. And as more of these these big deals, if they start to fall apart and more money becomes available, then that money, if we're going to transform the system, that money should go into the open world, and then that increases the amount of resources available. Question is, how do we get from point A to point B? But it does seem to me like we're definitely moving in that direction where more money will be potentially freed up for support of open memberships and subscribe to open deals.
Thank you. A question from Paige. I've been thinking that, one, as library budgets likely shrink in the coming years, it's a long one. Two, as access to e-resources replace purchases for physical materials. Three, as licensing restrictions supplant copyrights and library copyright exceptions. And four, as vendors require ongoing costs to maintain access to e-resources, that financing OA may be the primary way that libraries provide access to materials long-term for their users. Does this seem like a compelling way to get fellow libraries to support OA, and a compelling argument that libraries can present to our parent institutions and administrators?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I mean, that's making positioning open models, whether they're for monographs or journals or other resources, as being a viable alternative to closed models that simply don't scale, where there's simply not enough money to pay for them. Certainly makes sense. So I do a lot of librarian interest.
It does present some challenges, I think, for many libraries, though, because that transition point, right, that tipping point from we have to pay to get it to we should pay so everyone can have it, there are a lot of institutions that can't make that pivot, whether the individuals in the library want to. So figuring out how to socialize participation. Just thinking, I worked at a state-supported institution years ago, and our provost used to say, some money is greener than others, right? Like, I think that's an important concept to remember, that many institutions can't just choose to act in the greater good. They are restricted in what they're allowed to do. So I think that in Paige's question, you mentioned, how do we convince administrators? We also have to think that's those administrators go quite a ways up the chain to talk about how we can keep this revenue cycle moving.
And I mean, I would also say, just to jump in, that part of it is also on publishers to work on the sorts of models in the way that Raym has talked about, in that constructing models that have both in knowing behaviors are focused on social good, but also have an incentive, a private benefit that also sort of is likewise presentable to administrators or to the administration, to sort of say, yes, we're doing a lot for the greater good by doing this, but this is also a great thing for us. We get these extra benefits. And so I think that it's a collaborative effort in trying to make sure the models look as good for the higher ups from the library as possible. And part of that too is for us to get more feedback from libraries about how we do that.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one?
I just wanted to say too that, again, with one of the things I said about Tome is that what will make OA books a more persuasive case with administrators is the more evidence we can present of success. That is that, provosts and deans have been hearing for years and years that monographs sell fewer than 300 copies. They hear that over and over and over again. If they start hearing, gee, these books are being downloaded thousands of times and they're being used in parts of the world that those monographs were never reaching, that starts to make a compelling case for why you would invest in this for your faculty.
Yeah. And that actually segues really, really nicely into the next question about evaluating success. I'd like to hear how Peter, Emily, and Alison will evaluate the success of their current attempted initiatives, what metrics are being looked at to indicate sustainability, and especially Alison, what funds the consortium office in brokering OA deals.
Well, since I got called out by name, I'll go first. We're lucky, right? At PALCI, our business model gives us a lot of flexibility and kind of an endorsement from our members to do creative and innovative things. We're not funded on service fees or an overage on the payments that our members make for content, which I think is a benefit in some ways. It means that we're lean, we're very efficient. We're 3.5 people and 4 laptops, I think. But because we're not constructed around kind of a pay to play model, that what they've paid for by joining PALCI is my time and my colleagues' time. We get endorsement from our members by their participation in these kinds of offers. So we have a little more flexibility, I think, to develop what counts as successful. It's okay.
Anyone else?
I could just say, for us, again, for Tome, it's a 5-year pilot. So as I said, we're entering year 4. So we're really focused on, again, the being able to demonstrate through usage metrics. And that's why the Open Access eBook Data Trust project is so important, because it is a way to smooth the way towards getting more comprehensive usage statistics for OA books. So there's that aspect of it. And then for us, it's like, can we get more funding institutions to sign on? And the more that happens, the more we create that kind of momentum behind this idea of university funded subventions for open access books, the more that idea becomes embedded past the time of the 5-year pilot, the better off we will be, or we'll consider that success if we can contain that momentum.
Thank you.
And for us, just to quickly say, in answer to that question, for MIT Press and for this direct to open model, I mean, the initial marker of success will be, getting over the line and making the 2022 books open. And our hope is that will be for all of our monographs, but at the very least at least one of these collections. And then beyond that, I mean, looking at the stats from Tome, being able to see that for our own books, to see the sorts of increase in both downloads and usage, but also impact, considering ways that we might be able to measure things like increase in citation and things like that, that will be really where, that's going to be exciting to see.
And that also dovetails nicely into the next question. Michelle asks, regarding direct to open, perhaps your outreach starts in earnest in 2021, but I'm interested to know about the reasons you have heard so far when an institution declines to participate in your new model. What are the blockers to embracing different models as you perceive them so far?
I mean, that's a good question, and we'll have to see. I suppose, my experience having been in library sales is that proposals can look great from a value point of view, and yet it's the commitment to it can still sometimes be difficult. But we're hoping that in the way that this model is developed, it's both incredibly appealing from a financial perspective as well as from the sort of common good perspective. And I think, considering the year that we've had and how things are going, the increase in need for digital resources, I think that I guess we'll have to get back to you, Michelle, but we're hoping that this really is presenting something that in general will see a lot of uptake, and more than enough uptake, I hope.
Great. Thanks. A question for Alison and PALCI, from your experience, just trying to get a sense of what is offered to consortium members and what flexibility is available. This may be a follow-up from that initial question.
I think so. I think that's the clarification. Yeah. Right. So for PALCI specifically, we have a single membership model. You join and then you're in. And then you have access to the full portfolio of services and collections that we offer. That's where it kind of circles back to my point that the diversity of the consortial landscape makes these questions really complicated. There's not a single consortial approach, because many other consortia do in fact act collectively, where there is one suite of content. If you're in the consortium, you get that stuff, and you have different models and methods of sharing your input. For PALCI, it means that there's a little bit more herding of cats, maybe, for us to make sure that we're offering things that are interesting and responsive to our members' needs. And also, when we're trying to develop something that will actually serve our full membership, that means that we have to take a much more active approach in bringing our members on board. So we joke that it's the NPR funding style, where we show them the value of the content, we show them the value of the collection, we say, please give what you can, please come on board, and we'll try and do this together. But it is, for us at least, everything is a la carte at this point. There's quite a lot of flexibility.
Thank you. Sort of a similar question. A single publisher's catalog bundle is a problem from a library perspective, whether journals or ebooks, because we need to select titles from across publishers. The tome model with multiple publishers seems more likely for long-term success to me. Does MIT care to comment on this thinking?
Yes, and I think that's a really good question. I think, as Peter said in his presentation, and I think sort of was a thread throughout, it is really important that we have a diversity of models. One model is not going to solve this issue, and the great thing is that our model, the direct to open model, can coexist with Tome, can coexist with Mellon funding for books. And the result of all of these things existing within one ecosystem is that they will altogether mean more open content. So I think that, slowly we're getting there. It's just sort of step by step. And I think all of these experiments, get us further along to more open content.
I add to that I agree completely. That was kind of my part of what was behind my point about, the solution being particular to the U.S. higher education situation. And I think any solution we come up with, there needs to be collective action at the national level, but it's ultimately, I think, given our situation in the US, it's always going to be a patchwork. That's just the way things work in this country. And so I just think there are going to be these different models out there, and the way we, as those who are involved in these, we have to talk with one another, be communicating and finding ways to work together. And what's that term that they're talking about now with COVID about the Swiss cheese approach, the layered layers of Swiss cheese? I think that's going to be what happens in this realm as well.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time, but we have time for at least one more question. We've got one from Lisa Hinchliff. Many of the metrics being mentioned seem to indicate readers of OA content will be tracked / surveilled, number of readers, use of content, etc. As someone doing a lot of work about reader privacy, how is the data privacy consideration being governed in these various programs, generally and specifically for Peter and Emily?
I'm happy to jump in first. It's such an important question, and I've appreciated seeing more of the discussion surrounding privacy that Lisa's been involved in and others. At least our approach is to continue in the way that we have been, in that our open books will be up on the direct ebooks platform. And because we're working with libraries to open them, libraries that are supporters and get access to the back file, all of that will be IP authenticated. In terms of downloads from people that aren't sort of downloading from those IP ranges that are registered, they'll obviously be able to do that, but we won't have record of those individuals. So we won't have record of sort of individual downloading activity. We are starting to work with, I believe, with the IP registry, so that we'll be able to see a bit more information. And as Peter said, the open data trust will be another important piece of that for us to sort of get a better picture of open download statistics and so forth. But our intent is not to know, and I know this isn't uncomplicated, but we're not trying to look at track individuals. It's more sort of general behavior. And I know that triangulates in a complicated way across the internet, where individual users can be identified. Anyway, I'm talking myself into a spiral, but it's something that we're trying to pay attention to. Yes.
Yeah, and I would just echo that about the OA ebook data trust project. That's a key part of what they're addressing, and that's why that kind of the whole idea of this data trust is to bring together the publishers, the different organizations, all of the kind of data, the people who have investment in the data and what gets done with the data to cooperate. And privacy is a huge part of that equation. So for us, to me, again, I think all of these projects depend upon there being that project be successful, or some offshoot of that project be successful, because I think right now it's impossible when I try to collect for those first 25 books, tome books, to try to collect that usage data, it's impossible at this point. And we need some kind of centralized system that has buy-in, that has the trust of all of the different partners.
Thank you. Well, I believe that takes us right to the end of our time limit here. I want to again thank All of our presenters, Raym, Emily, Peter, Alison, thank you for your presentations and for such a rich discussion. Thank you to our attendees for the great questions that you submitted at the end. This is our final post-conference webcast for 2020. It's our final webinar of 2020. So this is a great way to wrap up what's been a difficult year for many, to put it lightly, but we're looking forward to starting things off in January 2021. We have our next webinar scheduled for January 13th with discussing open web tools with Gary Price and Curtis Michelson. So join us then. Until then, happy holidays, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks so much.